Enough. The GBV Conversation. Assalamu alaikum and hello. Welcome to the GBV Conversation. Enough. The GBV Conversation. The 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence is an annual international campaign that kicks off on the 25th of November and runs until the 10th of December. In South Africa, during this period, government, civil society and the private sector will host a series of community and sector dialogues and activities to foster a collaborative effort in dealing with GBV. The GBV Conversation team supports every effort to show commitment to this cause by educating and uplifting survivors, families and the community. Today's focus is on identifying different types of abuse and some of the root causes of gender-based violence. But firstly, we would like to extend our condolences to the families of Lauren Braden, who was a mother of two, and Rueda Umar, a 75-year-old grandmother, two victims of GBV in Cape Town this past week. May they rest in peace. I'm joined in studio today by our resident psychologist, IMA member, Fatima Ismail. Welcome, Fatima. Let me just give everybody a little rundown of who Fatima is. She's a senior clinical psychologist at the Department of Health, the Lentegeur Psychiatric Hospital. She has worked at the 𝙁𝙖𝙧𝙘𝙚𝙚 Center for 8 years in the field of counseling and conducting empowerment workshops on domestic violence. We also say a warm welcome to Dr. Marcelle Londt. Dr. Londt is the head of social work department at the University of the Western Cape. Dr. Londt has a very extensive CV, but we cannot get into all of that now. She has, however, contributed to the establishment of a child abuse and prevention treatment center. Her intensive focus has been on the interventions with victims of child abuse as well as perpetrators. Ladies, let's get right to it. Dr. Londt, could you give us an overview of what constitutes GBV globally and in South Africa particularly?
Thank you for inviting me to this very important conversation. I think, first of all, GBV is South Africa's second pandemic. So loosely we talk about 6 kinds of GBV. It's not only about women and children and girls. It's far more extensive than that. We look at violence against the LGBTQI community, systemic violence, we look at sexual violence, and we look at structural violence. That's over and above what happens between a couple. And so I think for this 16 days of activism, I would like us to start the conversation with where do we go from here, and to offer the public, offer the woman, and offer the perpetrator a different challenge so that we make a difference, so that we're not going to have the normal kind of this is what it is. The woman out there knows exactly what we're talking about. The perpetrator out there knows exactly what we're talking about. So I look forward to this conversation.
Do you think that the conversations that we should be having, we should then be changing the narrative?
Absolutely. I think the narrative is about saying to women, you're the expert of your own life and your own story, and we want to meet you with that. We don't want to give you claptrap advice. Do this, say something, because that's why women get killed in relationships. I'm not talking about the tragedy of the 2 women we just spoke about. I'm talking about the context of an intimate relationship. So let's change that narrative so that we keep women safe and we raise the accountability and responsibility of the perpetrator.
Absolutely. Fatima, can you expand on the most common form of gender-based violence, which is intimate partner violence?
Yeah. So, Moeshfika, intimate partner violence, I mean, if we look at just interpersonal violence, is the second highest burden of disease in South Africa. Okay, and that can tell you the extent of how severe it is. Okay, so intimate partner violence is between a couple. Okay, it can be, as Marcelle mentioned, it can be a couple in a heterogeneous relationship, in a LGBTQI relationship, it can be a family member, okay? And we specifically speak also about domestic violence when it comes to intimate partner violence, okay? Domestic violence is by and large, seen in different forms. Okay, so we can look at it can be somebody that's living in the home between a husband and wife, a boyfriend and girlfriend. It can be a family member that's living under the same roof. It can be a child towards a parent or likewise. Okay, so intimate partner violence is one of the most common forms of GBV, and it is, if you look at the statistics, it shows that 1 in 4 women is being abused in South Africa. Every 6 hours a woman is raped. This is already underreported. Okay, now it does not say necessarily that men don't get abused. Okay, so I want to say to listeners as well that men do get abused, but if we look at our statistics, men are in the minority. And for this, when we speak about IPV, we specifically also look at men, according to the statistics, largely as perpetrators of violence.
So that is what the statistics are showing, because sometimes, and I think we had this on the program last week, where somebody sent us a message and said to us, well, you're focusing only on women. And I think we have to once again make this clear that we are not only focusing on women in this program. We fully acknowledge the violence against all sectors of society. But what we are saying is that statistics are showing us that women are by and large the bigger part of the victim pool.
Yeah.
We have seen an increase in gender-based violence outreach and advocacy met with intense backlash. Dr. Londt, what do you think the reason is for this?
I think if we take a step back, with at the kind of expense of doing urban legends, but we take a look and we see at how women stood up for themselves, how they said enough is enough, how they empowered themselves, the bigger the backlash, the greater risk they were at. And that's what we talk about, the second surge with the pandemic. That's exactly what's happening with domestic violence and gender-based violence. So unless we support women, unless we hold the perpetrator accountable, and unless we reach those perpetrators who want to change, this backlash is going to continue. The stronger I become, the more vulnerable I am. And so that's the message, that's a different narrative that we want to engage in, that we mustn't be naive, that we empower women and that's the end of the story. It is not. It's the beginning of another horror story. So we need to change the pace. We need to change the messaging.
Fatima, do you think, touching on what Dr. Londt has said, that we are looking at this very much in silos and not necessarily as something holistic, as a holistic healing?
Yeah, absolutely. So Moeshfika, just with what Marcelle mentioned now, GBV has been a silent epidemic for a very long time. This is not something that has happened recently. And just because, we have a pandemic currently, and we're seeing more and more of this doesn't mean that it's never been an issue for a very long time, okay? So we've been having advocacy programs, we've been having outreach, and if we look at who is the backlash coming from, okay? It's largely from perpetrators of violence, it's largely from people and others who feel threatened, by the empowerment that's happening, right? And so we need to also look at, we are here for education and awareness, and it's really about, we want men to ally with us, to be part of the solution in addressing gender-based violence. So we are not here against you. Okay, we want you, we need you to have certain male-to-male conversations, for example, dialogues that need to happen within male-to-male context, and that is important.
That's a very, very good point that you raised, because it's not about women against men.
Yeah.
It is about us against the scourge of gender-based violence. Dr. Londt, have you found that is very much the narrative that you are often faced with, in that it's a female against male?
Look, when gender-based violence, when perpetrators are called out and when women speak up, there's a whole range of excuses and lots of self-piteous kind of comments. Most men who cannot stop themselves at some point feel that they're misunderstood, that they're being blamed unnecessarily, until you sit them down and say, let's talk about. And I think the undercurrent here is the man at home that doesn't want to change. The conversation he's having with his partner tonight, see those women that got killed? At least I don't do that. See what you're reading about in the newspaper? At least I've never done that to you. So we want to change that narrative. Let's look at what it is that you do without lifting your hands. Let's look at the damage you inflict by being vindictive and being spiteful and picking on the kids. And so let's open that conversation without shame, without blame, because we owe it to every boy child. We owe it to every girl child if we want to interrupt the cycle of abuse, whether it's in your family, whether it's in the partnership, whether it's in our community. We must have those conversations to save our kids.
100% right, Dr. Londt. Fatima, let's just quickly touch on it before we go for the break. What are the different types of abuse?
There's various types, and if we look at the Domestic Violence Act, that was enforced in 1998, it defines domestic violence as any act that is where one perpetrates violence to another, right, in the form of, it can be sexual, okay, and sexual abuse can be, I think, Marcelle, this is your area also, so come in. So with sexual abuse, it can be ridiculing somebody's behavior, their performance. It can be asking for specific demands, sexual demands, okay, that makes one feel uncomfortable. If we look at physical abuse can be hitting, slapping, punching, kicking. It can be, and many people, let me just say, Moeshfika, especially in specific communities, we tend to think that abuse is physical.
Yes.
Okay? So the Domestic Violence Act actually goes further and speaks about emotional and psychological abuse. Okay, and this is about belittling. It's also about humiliating one. It's about derogatory names, calling one, names in that way. And then also further down, it goes into financial abuse. Now, financial abuse, especially within our society today, so financial abuse can be where the perpetrator gives you, for example, money, asks you to run the household, and in this time ask you money back to do A, B, and C, and then threatens and says that you are stealing their money. Okay, but it can also, Moeshfika, be where, because you may have finances being spent on substances, for example, you may have finances being spent on other areas where it's not necessarily to the house and what needs to happen, and you find that actually we have women that may have had to steal money to put food on the table, right? And then the Domestic Violence Act further goes into covering intimidation, threats, stalking and harassment, as well as damage to one's property or entering one's residence. So it's quite large, okay? But we can, if we look at this, you might say, well, it covers actually a lot. It covers broadly. But why are we still finding this issue on hand? And we can look at, we've got all these lovely legislations that are in place,
yes,
but we have the lack of implementation.
Yes.
And this is an issue that we need to address.
Something that also always, comes to mind is that legislation means nothing without implementation. So for us to raise our hands and say, well, you know what, we've done so well, and this is what the Act says, and it needs to be, we need to get where we can implement what the Act says. We can implement, we have the resources for implementation. Do you find that the lack of resources that are afforded to the organizations and to the people fighting the scourge of GBV is what is hindering the implementation, Fatima?
No, I think it's more than that. No, resources is one thing. Okay, I think people's attitudes, people's beliefs, and this is, that plays a large role in whether you believe and you fight for the specific cause. Because if you don't, you're not going to support something and you're not going to see it. Okay? How many cases have been actually reported and nothing has been done about it? I have also been involved previously in research where police were asked, interviewed on the Domestic Violence Act, for example, what it stands for. Have you registered offenders in the registry? They don't know what it is. Okay, so there's a large portion of ignorance as well as uninformed and uneducation that needs to happen, or that is happening, but we lack still the implementation of actually believing that this is a problem. And I think that also we need to understand that many people believe that gender-based violence is a woman issue.
Yeah.
And it's not, because you have sisters, you have mothers, you have daughters. So this is all of our issue. We need to address it together.
Shukran, and thanks for that, Fatima. We're going for an ad break, and when we return, we'll continue with our conversation on gender-based violence. Enough. The GBV Conversation. Welcome back to Enough, the GBV Conversation, brought to you by the Islamic Medical Association and the Saad Department Center, and supported by Radio 786. Fatima, before the break we were chatting about what the different types of abuse is. What, in your professional opinion, are the root causes of gender-based violence?
This is a very, very broad question.
We have time.
Yeah. So there's plenty that we need to speak about over here. So one is, women have been marginalized for a huge number of years, okay? And we look at the attitudes and belief systems of people in general, okay? And we also want to talk about patriarchy, all right? We want to talk about, I'm trying to think about all the different themes that goes under this, okay? This overarching violence. If we look at South Africa itself, the history and the culture of violence, and if we look at just protests that are happening, it's quite violent, all right? Violence has become the norm, and it's also a means of expression of dissatisfaction. It's been happening in such a way where it's not seen as any problematic behavior, okay? So that's one aspect. And then we look at human rights violations, okay, around how the root causes takes place. I mean, we're looking at what are the definitions of both male and female. What are the gender stereotypes that we also grow up in, all right? And it's also quite enforced. I mean, who says that boys are supposed to wear blue and girls are supposed to wear pink? All right, we have our mothers, for example, that also enforces some of this and says, you're not a boy, so don't play with a car. All right, you're not a girl, so don't play with a doll. Okay, many of these boys end up becoming pediatricians, doctors, that ends up having to know things about children. But definitely gender stereotypes is a major role, where attitudes and beliefs also about what women and men, what are their roles in society. So we often see that men are seen as the protectors and the providers in the family, and we see women as perceived as being their place being in the home, their place as looking after children. Right? We see them as not necessarily being higher in terms of financial means and economically and in career as a male counterpart. All right? We find that many partners feel threatened by women that are in power. Right? So power is a huge root as well. If we look at gender-based violence, is about maintaining power and control. Right? And that power and control can take the form of different types of examples. Some of that can be, having, if you're brought up in a sense of needing to have a woman make up your bed, a woman end up having to clean up after you. If you get married, you're going to expect that this is a woman's job. And as soon as you're going to, as a woman, for example, argue that point or just debate it, you're going to be seen as you are not a proper woman.
But also, do you not think that when we say our roles in society have been defined and that is a problem, that it's not only the roles that are defined, it's the value attached to those roles?
Yes, yes. Okay.
Dr. Londt, given your extensive experience in this area, could you perhaps tell us more about sexual abuse and rape?
I think, before we look specifically at sexual assault and rape, we need to be clear about the drivers of gender-based violence. And we can't, we also look at the twin dynamics and the twin set of entitlement and patriarchal values that cut across. And that kind of cuts across sexual violence as well. The sense that you're not allowed to say no. So there's a very fine line. And when we talk about GBV, we almost invite women to say, did he smack you? Did he push you? We don't ask, what about the sexual violence in the bedroom? Because that area is so steeped in shame. Nobody wants to call the person they supposedly love a marital rapist, for instance. They don't want to acknowledge that because he wants to get back at me, he's molesting my daughter or subjecting my son to pornography. So the relationship between these areas and also the drivers.
So one comes back to the fact that there is so much guilt and shame associated with all of this, is that we actually have to be having, like you said right at the beginning, Dr. Londt, having the conversation to destigmatize, having the conversation that makes the conversation a normal one.
I think also to invite women to say, you're not being judged. You're not being judged because you're not leaving. You're not being judged because he rules the roost. You're not being judged because there are times you have to defer, turn the other cheek. There are times you have to give into sexual demands when you are so tired. We're not going to judge you for that. And I think this is particularly directed at professional treatment providers. We've got to be very careful what we say to women.
Absolutely.
We've got to be very careful, that we don't judge, because the drivers for sexual violence, for rape, for gender-based violence, there's a very fine relationship. And so I think the message that we want to acknowledge is, just today we're told that there's going to be shelters for women. So yes, GBV has been politicized. So who cares? Who cares? For now, we want the resources. We want it on the agenda. We want it in the public space. So if somebody's getting political mileage out of it, we're interested in keeping women and children safe. And we're interested in keeping men accountable, or even, those people that fall into this area. So we've got to shoot the elephant in the room that says,
definitely,
he only pushed me, he only smacked me, but I can't talk about the other stuff.
And Fatima, do you also find that women specifically tend to only view harsh physical abuse as abuse? Just what Dr. Londt was saying now, I have come across many a woman who've said to me, but he didn't push me that hard. He didn't slap me that hard, or even he only pushed me. He only slapped me. What do we say to that? How do we change that? How do we make women, men, young boys, young girls, a society across the board understand exactly what abuse is? Because it's not as linear as what perhaps it's stated in the Act. It's not as linear as when we write it down in an article. It encompasses so much more.
Yeah. So, Moeshfika, it's quite complex. And there's these subtle nuances, right? That exactly, it's not necessarily clear-cut. And therefore, women don't know that they're in abusive relationships, and hence why we're having these type of talks, So people generalize that it is a physical abuse, and if it is reported, men will also say, but I didn't hit her, So we tend to think that it's a physical thing, and oftentimes it's what's not being seen, it's what's not being heard. All right, it's that name calling that's happening. It's the, I mean, people tend to think also that rape cannot happen in marriage, right?
Yes.
So it's these subtle behavior patterns that one feels so uncomfortable with in those relationships that makes one, for example, you walk into a mall and you are so afraid to look around because my partner is going to say that I am busy cheating on him. All right, so I'm looking at somebody, so I'd rather keep my head down. It's about the isolation that happens when you are no longer visiting your family because your movement is being restricted. Your whereabouts is being managed around who do you speak to. You don't speak out of the bedroom, okay? So we don't talk about sex. We don't talk about if somebody violates us in that manner, all right? And then at the same time, we need to look at, when one speaks about all of this issues that's happening, all right, we tend to overlook what's really happening. So we tend to also, sometimes what can happen is that you can be in an abusive relationship, and especially many of us that are educated, we don't want to acknowledge that it is abuse.
Yes.
So we make excuses, we rationalize the behavior. We hope and we pray that it's not exactly what we think it is. All right, so we paint a specific picture, we make excuses. So you have a blue mark on your face, and when asked what happened, so I don't want to say that my partner had pushed me down the stairs. So I'd say, I got hurt, I fell, I knocked my head.
Yeah.
Right? It's these examples that one needs to, you feel that you need to actually make excuses and make excuse for that person's behavior. But it's these nuances that one needs to really delve further into.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite complicated. Abuse is not clear-cut at all.
Abuse is complex. And Dr. Londt, just touch on rape in marriage. What do you feel we need to get out there about rape within marriage?
I would like to take a step back and ask the question, what's in the best interest of all of us? That's the one thing. The second thing, there's one issue that we're overlooking, is that often the woman loves her husband or a boyfriend. And so for her to call him out, it's a huge betrayal. And so that's where the turning the other cheek comes. I think rape in marriage, the shame attached to it. You cannot go to a social worker, community worker and say, my husband forced me, especially if the rest of your family is telling you, you got married, you made your bed, lay on it. So, marital rape, saying no is not an option. So the conversation we want to have with both men and women is no means no. What part of no don't you understand? And saying no doesn't mean it's a rejection of you.
Yes.
Saying no means that I'm honoring myself and what I want and what I need at this point. Maybe tomorrow will be different.
Yes.
But once you go down that path, once you go down the marital rape path, there's no turning back. It's not going to stop.
Fatima, we are going to go for a break, but when we get back, I really just want to start thinking about it right now. Does our youth experience abuse in the same way? And what can we do to change the abnormal attitudes and beliefs around abuse that is almost seen as the norm these days? We are going to go for a quick ad break, and when we return, we'll continue with our conversation and get Fatima to answer this question for us. Enough. The GBV Conversation. Welcome back to Enough, the GBV Conversation, brought to you by the Islamic Medical Association and the Sadki Batman Center, supported by Radio 786. Before the break, we were speaking about whether our youth experience abuse in the same way and what we can do to change the abnormal attitudes and beliefs around abuse that is almost seen as the norm and normal these days. Fatima, what are your thoughts on that?
I want to first say that children who witness or experience abuse often grow up either becoming perpetrators themselves of abuse or end up becoming victims. Okay, so children model behavior. They imitate and mirror what they see. And for them, this already can become quite the norm. So you'll have a child, a girl child, for example, growing up, and if she sees, but mom stayed in an abusive relationship, this became the norm, she may find herself also staying in an abusive relationship and not seeing anything wrong with it. And boys may learn that violence is okay and that this is the way they deal with any issues relating to violence. And then we want to look at that, yes, youth do experience violence in different forms, okay? Our youth are challenged socially, okay, in different aspects. And if we look at just the age group and the stage that they are in, it's about identity formation. And many youth are pressured into conforming in a certain way, okay? And the violence that many of them experience are sort of the cyberbullying. And I mean, if we look at technology these days, all right, we have cyberbullying. We have, how many cases have we had of sexual images that has been texted around? We look at sexting, right?
Yeah.
And we look at how if you are not doing things in a certain way, we are going to blackmail you with these photos, with these images, right? And how the control and the manipulation and the power over that person, how that is exercised by the person that is actually in power is unbelievable. So our children are really feeling that they cannot necessarily, and already with the generational gap, okay, children are feeling that they cannot necessarily speak out, all right? They are feeling that they cannot, nobody's going to understand what they are experiencing, right? So, yeah.
Dr. Londt, do you want to come in here?
Fatima, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Children who grow up in abusive households, the impact on them often is the same as a child who's been a victim of incest. They're ashamed, they don't want to bring friends home, they don't want people to know what's going on in the house, they're overprotective of either the perpetrator or their mom. They feel it's their fault, they've done something. So when the behavior starts telling us that there's a problem, we need to think about what is it that this child has been subjected to. And I think the sad part is when we hear about exposed to teens who take their own lives because they don't have the words to explain what has happened to them. And so my challenge to a mom who's in a relationship, if you're turning the other cheek, your daughter's learning to turn the other cheek. If you're the dad and you shout and you bully, your son is going to do that because he gets immediate results. He can control in the short term and in the long term. So if you, as the dad, you give your wife a look, and we all know what that look is about, and she keeps quiet, your children are learning from that.
Our children mirror what we do.
They mirror that, but not only that, the intensity of their trauma. And so when they start acting it out, you know, we take the kids to psychologists like Fatima or social workers like myself, but we don't acknowledge the kind of link and the impact on youth. And I think the other reality is you need to look at psychiatric facilities. Look at all the girl children as young women being admitted with over-the-counter addictions, being admitted with substance abuse issues. You know, look at the kind of psychological trauma they, and why? Because they've not been able to speak out or speak up.
Ladies, sorry,
just to
Fatima?
add to that, I mean, Marcelle, I've also seen an increase in children self-harming behavior. You know, it's cutting. You know, it can be any form. It can be cutting themselves.
Yeah.
It could be, and I mean, often in places that you are not seeing. So many would wear long sleeves and you don't see this cutting, and it's really used as the way of coping with their emotions.
Ladies, we come to a very interesting part of this gender-based violence conversation. We're coming to the myths regarding abuse, and this is something that I am looking forward to tackling. Let's start at the first one, and both your input is absolutely valued. The first myth: alcohol and substances. Alcohol and substance use causes abuse. Dr. Londt, you're shaking your head. I'll go to you first.
I want to be polite and not use bad words, but bull dust. The man who abuses, the person who abuses, and they don't have the luxury of substances is far more dangerous. Sometimes the guy that drinks, the guy that's using drugs, yeah, there is a connection, but he's often too drunk to lift his hands up. So we cannot say that's a causal factor. There is a link, but it's not a cause. It's not the causal factor.
So many women have been abused by their partners who have been sober. All right?
Yeah.
So alcohol can be a contributing factor, but it's in no way the cause. And we often find that this myth around, but he didn't know what he was doing because he was under the influence.
But
right?
do we find, ladies, that that's also then used as an excuse?
Yeah. Sadly so.
There's another part to that. A couple goes out to go to a party or something, and there's alcohol involved. So she decides to do the lambada, heaven forbid, with somebody else, and his jealousy and his possessiveness gets flamed. So on the way home, he's going to drive fast to frighten her, he's going to beat her up, and that starts a whole thing. So alcohol does play a role with some partners. But like Fatima says, to say it's the cause, nah.
Now, another myth that we need to get to is you asked for it. You provoked the perpetrator. It's your fault. Dr. Londt, what do you say to that?
That's an age-old excuse. See what you made me do? I would never have done this if you only kept quiet, if you didn't go to your mother, if you don't do what I tell you to do, if you cook what I want you to cook, even if it's in the middle of the night. So that's one of the age-old excuses and rationalizations.
Fatima?
So just to say, there is no excuse for abuse. There is no excuse for abuse.
So you provoked me, it's your fault.
Nobody makes you do anything. Okay? Nobody can. You choose. There's always a choice. You choose to react in a way and to act out abuse. Nobody makes you do it.
One of the myths we have to get to before we wrap up this conversation: abuse is a private and family matter. Ladies, go.
Bull dust. It's only a private matter, and the privacy is often located. The perpetrator who's kind of committed to a career in perpetration is going to lock that bedroom door, is going to beat her up where nobody can see the signs and the injuries. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing private about that kind of humiliation. Fatima, I'm sure you would
Absolutely.
have
And again, abuse is everyone's concern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is no such thing as I spoke out of what was happening in the home, because it is everybody's concern. It's not a private and family matter. It's your matter. It's my matter. It's our listeners' matter.
Mm.
Dr. Londt, in closing, what are the warning signs and red flags of an abusive relationship?
Look, the research, the kind of evidence that we have, there's about 10 issues. A history of abuse, being exposed as a child, hurting anybody who gets in the way of wanting to protect your wife, anger, impulsivity, a pathological jealousy, the age-old values and belief systems that my wife is my property, I own her. So those are there's about 10 factors, and usually I ask women to tick off those factors. If you're ticking about 7, 8, there's a very good chance that you could end up as a femicide statistic. So we have to familiarize ourselves. That also gives us an indication who are the people, who are the men that can respond to help. It's not every man who was exposed to childhood abuse that's going to become a perpetrator. He might simply become an alcoholic or addict or a pornography addict or spend all his time at the casino.
Yeah.
And that said, Marcelle, you know, that there is, I mean, with what you're just speaking about now around the different profiles, also just to mention, whatever we are saying at this moment, I mean, there can be 10 different flag points, but there is no specific profile of a perpetrator.
Yes.
It can be the person, the well-known businessman that everybody knows, right? It can be the religious leader. So there is no specific profile that we can actually say your partner fits into the specific blocks. We can look at the warning signs, and these are red flags for you to look at, that something may not be right, you know. And these are also parts where you can already intervene. You know, do you allow, for example, that jealousy around, no, I rocked up at your work because I actually wanted to surprise you. Okay, I checked your phone, or I deleted these numbers. So it's not about love. There's a difference between love and jealousy, and also respect.
Yes.
All right, respect and love. Because I mean, as we were speaking earlier about children learn about relationships and marriages within their homes by witnessing their moms and dads and looking at the love and the respect between them.
I think that's a very valuable point. Ladies, we have to unfortunately wrap up now. We really want to thank you for your valuable input. And listeners, we really invite you to tune in again next week as we delve into the cycles of abuse and ask the question, why do women stay in abusive relationships? We invite you all to wear a white ribbon in support of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, but we would like the support for 365 days of the year. Being abused is not your fault. Please, please do not be silent about it. Being violated is a crime. Speak out. Together we can make the difference. We have to change this narrative. Enough is enough.